And this Saturday in Washington, D.C., the Amir Khan Roadshow continues when he defends his 2 light welterweight world titles against local fighter Lamont Peterson, a fighter who was really raised on the streets next to the venue. From the age of 5 until 10, Lamont was homeless, a street kid in the truest sense of the word. Now, Khan has been on the road in 3 of his last 4 fights. This will be his 4th out of 5. It's quite a lot, really, isn't it? It's been hard, but it's also been impressive. Saturday's fight is live on BBC 5 Live after midnight on Saturday, and 5 Live's man out in Washington, D.C. is Mike Costello, and working with Mike for this fight is Paulie Malignaggi. Now, the former world champion had a hard time in the ring with Khan and Ricky Hatton and Miguel Angel Cotto. No doubt in the size of Paulie Malignaggi's heart or guts. Anyway, I spoke to Paulie and Mike a bit earlier, and I started by asking if DC felt like a fight city.
In one word, Steve, no, it doesn't. There's been a big push behind the local government here. There was a mayoral reception yesterday for the fighters, the main fighters and the undercard, and they all spoke about how they want to make Washington, D.C. a fight city again. They've not had World Championship boxing here for a dozen years since their great flyweight and super flyweight Mark Too Sharp Johnson was around. Incidentally, he was inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame this week, and that's made a lot of news here rather than the fight itself. So while the promoters obviously and the local government have been pushing it, our impression on the street is that people don't really know the fights coming up, and secondly, they don't know an awful lot about Lamont Peterson. And I'll give you an example, Steve. I was in an electrical store yesterday just buying something, and as I checked out, the guy, copped the accent and then said, "Are you guys here on vacation?" And I said, "No, I'm here for the fight." And he said, "MMA." And we've had that 3 or 4 times this week, how when you talk about a fight here in Washington, D.C., and maybe across the States now, people think you're talking about MMA or UFC or something else. So it's been a difficult sell this week. I mean, I would say, on the contrary, as I came through customs this week, the customs officer who stamped my passport and all that did know about the fight, but said that he's going to be watching it at home because it's too close to Christmas to buy a ticket. So in all ways, it's going to be a tough sell. And yet the amazing thing is, Mike, that over here, the papers are lapping up Peterson's story. And if the fight was here, he'd be on chat shows with his backstory. He really would. That's the irony involved here. And one of the surprising elements, Steve, is that a lot of the local journalists are learning about Lamont Peterson's story for the first time as well. And it's a great story in print, but it's proving very difficult to sell this fight here. On a wider scale, it's just a fight rather than anything bigger than that.
Now I know you've got Paulie Malignaggi there, who's going to be working with you at ringside both this week in Washington, and Paulie's obviously been in the ring with Amir, shared the ring with Ricky Hatton, shared the ring with Miguel Cotto. Paulie, if I could ask you, is this a dangerous fight for your old opponent Amir?
I think anytime you get in the ring is a dangerous fight. I don't think Amir is fighting anyone that's not a dangerous guy anymore. I mean, when you defend the world title, only worthy opponents are chosen as title defense opponents. Having said that, I do think Amir, his experience, his ability to adjust, his just overall, I think he's a little bit better than Lamont Peterson. But it doesn't mean Lamont is not dangerous, and it doesn't mean Lamont is not going to come to fight. You got to also keep in mind this is the biggest career fight for Lamont Peterson, so he may be a little bit more charged up and a little bit more motivated than past fights as well.
Now, Paulie, in your years floating around different gyms and fighting in different places, have you had any contact with Lamont Peterson? Have you shared the ring with him by any chance anywhere?
No. I've never sparred him, and with the exception of a casual hello, I've never really spoken to Lamont that much. We were a different generational gap in the amateurs. I was more from the 2000 amateur class. He was more in the 2004 amateur class. So we didn't really run into each other that much. Okay, and Mike, as we go into this fight, once again, like many fights that we've had the last few years, people are looking at the next fight. It happened with Joe Calzaghe, and it happened with David Hay, and it happened with Ricky Hatton. And of course, Amir's got these carrots out there, these kind of Pacquiao, Mayweather, even Cotto's name has been mentioned. Is there a danger? Is there a slight danger that he could take his eyes off of the Lamont Peterson prize?
I don't think there is. I was wondering about that earlier in the week when we were talking to Amir and Freddie Roach at Amir's hotel, which is very close to the White House. And I just think that once they get this close, Steve, once they get to fight week, that's when the concentration really narrows towards the one single opponent. They may have been thinking longer term, you know, back in the early stages of the training camp, but now it's very much focused on Lamont Peterson, and he's got Freddie Roach and Alex Ariza around him, and they're making sure that he stays on that single track. And what's fascinating is that Freddie Roach, as ever, has made a forensic study of Peterson, and it's a joy to listen to him breaking down what Peterson does, and how, you know, going back to what Paulie's been saying to us at various stages today about how Lamont Peterson is quite strong in the pocket, but Amir Khan is very, very adept at not allowing fighters to stay there. He's in and out very quickly, and you know, incidentally, that's how Timothy Bradley beat Lamont Peterson, by swiftly moving in and out and not allowing Peterson to stay in the pocket. And that's been the big lesson that Freddie Roach has been imparting on Amir all the way through their training camp.
Paulie, what about this cheeky news that Freddie Roach sneaked a few rounds on the mitts, on the pads, as we call them in the UK, with Lamont Peterson at a recent sort of Olympic training camp? I'm surprised Peterson allowed himself for that to happen, and according to Amir, Freddie has solved all of the Lamont Peterson, just like that, 3 rounds, and Freddie's an expert. Bosh, bish, bosh, let's move on. What do you make of that, Paulie?
I don't know. I think it's more. I don't want to say it's hogwash, but I think it's more just to hype things up. I mean, I'm sure Lamont didn't show much, and I'm sure Freddie wasn't trying to see much either. I mean, in 3 rounds, I just knowing Lamont was going to fight Amir. I mean, I can't imagine anything coming out of that pad session.
I think what's emerged this week, Steve, is that it was actually 2 days before they signed to fight.
Oh, tricky
Freddie.
Freddie.
Freddie knew it was in the background. I mean, obviously Barry Hunter, who was there as well,
Yeah.
Lamont Peterson's coach, knew that there was something in the offing, but I don't think anybody realised it would be done as quickly as it was, and it was all signed and sealed 2 days later. So Freddie had that information, and he says, look, I shouldn't really have done it, but hey, you take whatever advantage you can.
In the days before YouTube and phones and the internet, when I can remember various amateur trainers, I can remember amateur trainers telling boxers to turn southpaw when they were warming up, just to confuse people. But I think those days are well and truly gone. Well, listen, fellas, it's been a pleasure talking to the pair of you. I hope something kicks in the next 24 to 48 hours.
Well, that often happens, Steve, doesn't it?
Yeah,
so, and I get the sense it might do here. We've got a press conference coming up today and the weigh-in tomorrow, and I think it will be bigger than it feels at the moment.
Okay. And Bernard Hopkins probably be in town, getting a feel for the White House, where he's inevitably going to try and end up at some point in the next 30 years, and that's going to be entertaining. If Hopkins shows up at your press conference or shows up Saturday afternoon, that's good enough for you. That'll warm you up.
He showed up at a press conference headed by the local mayor yesterday, Steve.
Yeah.
He got up to speak, and as far as I know, he's still speaking now.
Yeah, no. Hopefully his shoulder is a little better.
Yeah, well, thankfully he talks from the hip and not from the shoulder, Paulie. And Paulie, if you're going to be on my show, I make the jokes, okay? That's the way it works.
All right, sounds good, Bunsey. I'll keep that in mind.
Listen, fellas, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Have a safe couple of days. Enjoy the fight, and I'll speak to you soon.
Cheers,
Talk
Steve.
soon. Cheers.
That's Mike Costello out there with Paulie Malignaggi, who's going to be, as they say in America, calling the fight with him. That fight's on 5 BBC Radio 5 Live in just after, maybe a bit early, not 4 in the morning, maybe about 2 o'clock or something. I did a piece on Lamont Peterson this week in the Independent, and doing the research for it, and I talked to Lamont when he was over here about 2 months ago. You know, he tells some grim stories, so you sort of take them with a pinch of salt. But, you know, you sort of take it a little bit. So you do a bit more research, and all of it's true. But basically what happened was when the main drug of destruction hit the American cities on the East Coast in the 80s, that drug being crack, it caused beyond havoc. I mean, whole areas were wiped out overnight. I mean, this is like The Wire, but without the, without the glitz, and there was no glitz involved in The Wire. And what happened to Lamont? I think he was one of 12. I think there was one of 11. There was 6 brothers, 5 sisters. They all got hit hard, including the father, who eventually lost his job, became a serious crack addict, and they slowly but surely started to lose lose their house. The water was turned off, the heating was turned off, then eventually it was boarded up, reclaimed. There was nothing left in there to sell. And Lamont was 5. His father was in prison, and at one point, I think as many as 2 of his brothers were in prison. And this is, if anyone's ever travelled to Washington DC, you see the White House and you see the fantastic statue and the fantastic memorials, especially the Vietnam Memorial. It's really moving. It sucks your breath away. But there's nothing quite like the streets just back from the White House. They're fearsome, they're scary, they're horrible. And Lamont lived on them for 5 years, basically. When he eventually did find a boxing club when he was 10, he had to be completely deloused for body lice and hair lice. But he'd lived in bus shelters, he'd been on street corners, he'd been arrested, he'd been a dealer, he'd been a runner for drug gangs, he'd been part of what's euphemistically called a pickpocketing gang, which means he was a mugger. And he's still only 10 years of age. And it's really harrowing stuff. And they turned it round through the boxing gym. One of those all-time great turn it round through boxing stories. And there are thousands of them. But his story might just be about the best. I think quite serious. And I wrote about that in the Independent on Tuesday. But I think the greatest story about a boxer turning it around, of course, belongs to Manny Pacquiao, who, as the story goes, left his village, left his mother and father and brothers, and sort of took off for 3 days on a tuna boat to get to Manila, all because his dad had killed a dog that Manny had befriended, and the reason he killed the dog was to feed the other brothers, the rest of the family. Now, it's probably a complete and utter lie, but what a great story that is. Now,